We are just trying to get to grips with Zoom webinar, Finn and I, because we released quite a few extra tickets over the last couple of weeks. We've had to upgrade to a much bigger platform, so you'll have to forgive us if it's not quite as slick as we normally would do when we're doing a webinar. But I know there are quite a number of people that are joining us today, so we will just give it a couple more minutes to get everybody, as many people in as possible. But I know we've had contact from quite a few people to say that something else has come from school, as it always does, and they'll be joining us with the recording a little bit later. We've also had a number of emails and direct messages and all kinds of contact from people asking who didn't manage to reserve a ticket for the event if they can have access to it. So anybody you know who wanted to come and see this live, who hasn't been able to, we're looking at how we can share this more widely for free, so that it can be used by as many people as possible over the next week or so. So watch out for information on that. If you'd like to message as well particular panelists or to the whole group, you've also got that function in the chat as well. But we'll monitor both the chat and the question and answer section as we run through the session today. Right, before we start, I'm just going to run a quick poll. So please feel free to answer it and I'll share the results, and then we'll do all the introductions and what have you as we go through. Okay, here's the poll. Okay, so answers are coming in for this already. So we've got obviously quite a lot in the middle. I'm getting there and not quite ready yet. We've got a few people who are super ready, which is really good to see. Not many, only 4% at the moment. We might have to call on them to be panelists in our session. We will. And we've got a few people who are not ready at all yet. So a real range, but most people are in the middle. It seems to be almost evenly split between I'm getting there and I'm not quite ready yet. And we've got, we're coming up for nearly 150 people have signed on to this now. So I think we're almost ready to start the session. So I'm just going to share those results with you all so that you can see them. And we might run that poll again towards the end, maybe after we've had an open and honest discussion. Those results might even be slightly different. Okay, so you can see results there, absolutely evenly spread between I'm getting there and I'm not quite ready yet. So lots of people in that area where there are still questions to be explored. And I think Finn and I, from the discussions that we've had over, sorry, I've just forgotten completely to introduce ourselves. We're just assuming that everybody knows who we are because we've just been chatting to our panel for the last half an hour. So my name's Jane Miller. I'm one half of Impact Wales. And my colleague Finola sitting next to me is the other half of Impact Wales. And we've been planning these events for a good, well, since 6 months. Yeah, since about the autumn, which has been really exciting. So we're so chuffed that we're actually here today with the first session. I know we postponed the first one, if those of you who bought tickets for the April one, but we just felt that with everything going on in school at the moment, and obviously is still going on, particularly in secondaries, that we felt the time was right really just to postpone it for a couple of weeks. So we've got another session coming up now in May, later in May. Today, 2 weeks time. And then we've got another one, the third date we've shifted to September, but because you've got tickets for today, your tickets will stand there for the other two as well. And don't forget our hashtag on Twitter, hashtag Let's Talk Assessment. Please do tweet. Normally in this kind of event, we would be tweeting furiously, but I'm going to have to put that aside for this afternoon because we're going to be doing the technical side of today. Right, let's make a start. Can I say welcome to you all to our first Let's Talk Assessment event, our open and honest discussion about assessment in curriculum for Wales and the challenges and the opportunities that are in front of us all. The reason that we arranged these events was we felt that a lot of the school support that we were providing, we were talking to people in schools about various different elements of the curriculum, and the thing that they kept on coming back to was assessment. And we felt that there wasn't a discussion happening about assessment in any kind of open forum. So we just felt that we needed to talk about assessment. So that's what we're doing, is we are talking about assessment today. All of the people that I'm going to introduce in a second who are sitting on our panel are people just like you, teachers, leaders, people working in classrooms in schools across Wales who are grappling with the Curriculum for Wales documents just like you. So we're not here today to provide answers. What we are here today is to explore the questions, explore Curriculum for Wales, and start to gather ideas about what this might look like in practice, but just to give you a chance to really crystallise your own ideas and to maybe think about further questions or discussions that you want to have back in school. And we're also delighted that we've got not only our panel members, but we also got some key experts on assessment and on assessment within Curriculum for Wales, who very, very kindly created some films for us that we're going to play at the beginning of each of our sessions so that you can see different purposes of assessment as identified by Curriculum for Wales, and that they open up that discussion and give us some ideas to explore. And the very first of our experts today is Stacey, who's a former history teacher from a secondary school in Swansea. He's now senior lecturer at University of Wales Trinity St David, a Throfa, and he's going to be starting off our season today with looking at this that you can see on the screen, supporting individual learners on an ongoing day-to-day basis. And the reason that that is on the screen is because it's in his presentation as well, but it just gives you a little bit of extra time to have a look at it.
Can I just add into that though? Sorry, Finn, to give you a breather. Just to respond to a question from Emma in the chat that she's just asked, are the three, I can't speak now today, are the three sessions the same or do they follow on from one another? And I think that should be quite apparent as we go through the session today, that they are a series of three different, and we're looking at different things within each one. And the focus of today is what Finn
we're looking at the three purposes for assessment identified in Curriculum for Wales. So each of the events takes one of those purposes and looks at it in detail. So that's the outline for each of the three events. So yes, they do follow on one from each other. So let me just introduce our panel to you that you'll see arranged there at the top of your screen in the videos at the top. We have in our secondary camp, we have Barri, who is Welsh lead at Risca Comp and one of the people behind the 15-minute forum, which on Twitter, who've been really instrumental on getting that discussion going about Curriculum for Wales and looking at it in a little bit more detail. Welcome, Barri. We have Damian Benney, who is Deputy Head Teacher at Penyrheol Comprehensive, and he's also a science teacher, and he's very active in the world of research-informed practice. He's a speaker and again, very active on Twitter. A lot of our contacts come from Twitter because we love Twitter. And then we have Ceri Richmond, Deputy Head Teacher from Morriston Comprehensive, also a geography teacher, and again, someone who's very interested in research-informed practice. We have Steph Robertson, Head of Geography from Pencoedtre High, who's currently writing the Geography Curriculum for Wales Handbook at Key Stage 3 for HODA. She's also a member of our advisory board. And we haven't got quite as many people from primary. We're a little bit secondary heavy today, but we've been racking our brains for people to ask. So if you know anybody who's primary focused who'd like to be a panelist, then we're more than happy to have them on second and third events. But today we have Andy Keegan, who's a primary colleague from Pontlliw Primary in Swansea and someone who's been an interrogator of changes to education in Wales. And we also have Melissa Armishaw, Head of Waunfawr Primary in South East Wales, who has been working incredibly hard, as we all have, to make school a safe and enjoyable place during the pandemic. So what I'm going to do next, and just forgive me if the technical side of things is a little bit slow, is I'm going to start the film from Dave to make sure that we've got the focus for today. Okay, here we go. So Dave, talking about the first purpose for Curriculum for Wales.
Hello everyone, my name is Dave Stacey. I'm a former history teacher, now lecturer at the Throfa, which is the Centre for Education at the University of Wales Trinity St David. In this video for Impact Wales, I'm going to share a few thoughts about the new assessment arrangements proposed in the guidance for the new Curriculum for Wales, and in particular, the way that assessment can be used to help support individual learners on an ongoing day-to-day basis. The focus of much of the conversation then of the last few years has been on curriculum, and yet there's widespread recognition that curriculum alone is not going to be a sufficient driver to bring about all the improvements in the education system that we are hoping for. A special edition of the Curriculum Journal in 2016 pointed out that traditionally, education systems innovate as if the curriculum, pedagogy and assessment systems are independent of each other, but there may be greater mileage in thinking of them as interlinked and interdependent systems. Decisions we make about one will have an impact on another. And so while today we're focusing on assessment, I want to start by encouraging you to think about the connections between these three systems. Before we move on, my obligatory reminder that if you're a member of the Education Workforce Council, which I expect most of you are, then you'll have access to academic journals like this one through the EBSCO database, which you can access via your PLP. There's guides on how to do this via the Professional Development tab on the EWC website. So this aligned model has been the vision for curriculum for reform in Wales from its inception. But within the current guidance, you can see that there are repeated references both to the word assessment and to the word progression, which is a key idea that underpins the new model. So while it can be helpful to look at each element in turn, we have to fight the temptation to see these as separate and work to ensure that our conversations are about those points of interconnection. To help orientate us within the documentation then, the three topics identified by Impact Wales are drawn from the assessment guidance entitled Supporting Learner Progression. And it might be helpful to make this as a starting point for you as you think around assessment. And this diagram can be helpful to shape our thinking with the learner at the centre, surrounded by those four purposes, and then these key principles which Welsh Government suggests should underpin our work on assessment. Now, I don't have time in this short video to review them all, but they do help to signal some of the key shifts in thinking between our current assessment model and the one which will better support the ambition of the new curriculum and the reform programme more widely. Beyond that diagram then, the document goes on to suggest three purposes for assessment. And it's these that are the focuses of the three workshops that colleagues from Impact have developed. And just a reminder then that our focus for today is on the first of these, there you go, supporting individual learners on an ongoing day-to-day basis. I'm aware that people in our audience will have different levels of engagement with the document and particularly the guidance around assessment. So I just want to pick out one or two ideas from the start of the section on the purposes of assessment, which might help to make some useful points for discussion. I don't propose to read these out. The wonderful thing about video presentations is that you're welcome to press that pause button at any point. I should say the bold in the second extract is mine, but to my mind, this whole process encourages us to put our established practices under the spotlight and ask if they continue to be fit for purpose. We need to think about what we're going to stop doing in order to make way for the new, being mindful all the time that the answers won't be found in a document on the shelf somewhere. We're all going to need to do some of the hard thinking that those colleagues from pioneer schools were asked to do when they did such a lot of work in shaping, drafting and redrafting these curriculum documents. To give just one example from the development process, the decision to change the term achievement outcome, which was used in Successful Futures, to descriptions of learning, which is in the curriculum documentation. And it was driven by a concern that that original term had links with existing practices with a focus on assessment for summative purposes, and a desire to better signal a change in mindset towards a system that places a higher value on forward-facing assessment for formative purposes. Let's look then at this text from supporting individual learners on an ongoing day-to-day basis. And a reminder straight away then that the assessment should be supporting this shift in our focus to a holistic view of the learner and their learning. The idea of dialogue with learners is another key idea that we might want to pick up on in a discussion shortly, but I'll draw your attention to the primary focus here as being forward-looking and to identify not just additional support that may be required, but additional challenge as well. The view on assessment here isn't something that happens at the end of a unit, but is an ongoing process which feeds into and becomes part of the learning process. And this last sentence, I think, links here with some of these wider purposes that will be the focus of the other two workshops. In the materials for this session, colleagues from Impact made reference to the CAMI project. So I just want to speak briefly about what that was. It was a joint project between colleagues at the University of Wales, Trinity St David's, and the University of Glasgow. It was part funded by the Welsh Government, and it was designed to support staff from pioneer schools and all those involved in the development of the curriculum in moving forward thinking on progression. We reviewed literature on progression in the areas of AOLEs. We supported colleagues through workshops to capture teachers' thoughts around progressions, and we interviewed a number of those who've been involved in the process of developing these descriptions of learning for the new curriculum. We also developed a pupil experience toolkit to support teachers in capturing the views and experiences of children and young people of their experiences of progression in a way that feeds those conversations into the kinds of discussions that hopefully schools and teachers will be having. Now, the reports are available via the Athrova website and the University of Glasgow website, and the Pupil Experience Toolkit is available for anyone to use in schools. You can access it from Hub, or you can email me to get your hands on a copy as well. So in the final few minutes of this video then, I'd like to share a few ideas that could become points of discussion, as well as 7 questions which might be helpful in shaping conversations around how we support individual learners. I've already mentioned the importance of our choice of words in helping to shape our thinking. And I think we're probably all familiar with the terms summative assessment, formative assessment, assessment for and of learning. But sometimes as we become familiar with these phrases, it can stop us from pausing to think and consider what lies underneath those words. So 4 quick thoughts on this slide there. Ruth Down in her 2014 article asks us to consider assessment as learning. And how many of us are using something like multiple choice quizzes as a way of strengthening recall, strengthening learning, rather than simply as a tool for measuring? And if the same activity can be used for different purposes, perhaps, as Wyn Harlan suggests, it might be helpful to rearrange our words slightly and talk of assessment for formative purposes rather than formative assessment, shifting our focus from the assessment activity to the uses to which we put the information and insights we gain from the activity. Dylan William once commented that he considered the term responsive teaching as an alternative to assessment for learning, ultimately rejecting it as he didn't feel it sufficiently captured the role of the learner in the process. But nonetheless, I think this expression helps us shift our focus back to that Venn diagram and the interplay between learning, curriculum, and assessment. And finally, then, it might be helpful to bear in mind the warning from Beth Ann Marshall and Mary Jane Drummond's paper all the way back from 2006, where they observed a focus on procedures and practices risked limiting teachers to thinking about the letter of AFL rather than the spirit. Now, we're trying hard to avoid surface learning for our students. We need to avoid that for our staff as well. Their conclusion chimes with much of what the research tells us about issues with curriculum development internationally, namely the problem of enactment. I quote, "The evidence of this project suggests that teachers need to engage in debates about learning as well as act on practical advice to bring about change." And perhaps that again reinforces the need to bring colleagues together to debate and discuss, just like hopefully this will. And so to end, some ideas, some suggestions, some provocations to feed into our session this afternoon, but also for you perhaps to take back to your school and settings as ways of kickstarting some conversations about how you can develop policies, strategies and practice to realise this ambition of supporting individual learners on an ongoing day-to-day basis. How do we avoid that risk then of surface implementation, of that tick list approach? How do we engage all our staff in the hard thinking that's going to be needed to realise the promise of the spirit of AFL, not just the letter? I've put a reference there to Dylan Williams' book, Embedded Formative Assessment, which remains 10 years on my go-to when I'm thinking about bringing together strategy with the ideas that underpin them. Can we think about our assessment practices and be willing to ask why we do the things that we do? Daisy Christodoulou will be providing a video for another one of these sessions, and her work on the use of comparative judgment is just one area where we might want to start thinking again about the ways in which we do assessment. In those conversations then, let's be clear about the purpose of this assessment. How do we keep that focus on development, future development, rather than just judgments of past activity? If assessment is a day-to-day process, what types of feedback are most appropriate at different points? How do we avoid damaging learning with unhelpful feedback and assessment practices? The work of Robert Bjork here on ensuring desirable difficulties may be helpful. We need to recognise that there is more to learn about progression, especially in some aspects of learning, and especially at a more granular level. As teachers, we need to be not sat waiting around for the answer to ride in on a white horse. We need to roll up our sleeves and get involved in helping each other through this uncertainty, using that undoubted professional knowledge and wisdom that exists within our profession. The final two ideas here, I think, speak to the whole assessment challenge in Wales and around the world, but I've only got the one video, so I'm going to mention them here anyway. How do we ensure that we link a growing understanding of curriculum, pedagogy, assessment and progression? These things need time, but we need to ensure that the structures we create to support them don't accidentally create silos of thought and practice. And finally, how do we shift our focus towards assessment practices which are forward-looking and focus on learners' next steps, rather than something that is primarily backwards looking with a forward glance at the end? So, no simple answers, I'm afraid, but hopefully some food for thought and some references above that might start feeding those conversations. Let me duck out the way so you can get that last one. There we go. And so there we are. Thanks for sticking with me to the end. I look forward to the discussion that's going to follow. If you're coming to the video after the event, you're welcome to contact me on Twitter, or my email address is on the screen. Thank you ever so much.
Whilst Finn is just doing a little bit of logistics with the IT, thank you ever so much, Dave. That was really, really useful at the start to enable the discussion to begin today. Can I just also remind you as well that as we're doing the question and answer session with the panellists, could you, if you've got any particular questions you'd like to ask, can you use the question and answer function at the bottom of your screen, and we can direct those to the panellists as we run through. But if you've got any technical queries, can you just pop those in the normal chat, and I'm just trying to monitor the two as we run through.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Dave, for that really interesting video about exploring the first purpose, supporting individual learners on a day-to-day and ongoing basis. And I think when we talk about day-to-day ongoing basis, we're talking about formative assessment. But I'm going to start, panelists, you'll all be really pleased to hear, I'm going to start with a nice, easy discussion to start off with. There is still, I think, worthwhile looking at what are the key differences between formative and summative assessment, and what do you think some of the challenges might be, particularly with formative assessment? So I'm just going to ask, is there anybody who would like to start us off? If you're ready to start us off, just give us a wave or stick your hand up function. Or I'm going to, oh, there you go, Steph and Damian. So Steph first, give us a little bit of information on formative and summative assessment.
Hi, Finn. Hi, everyone. Well, for me, Dave hit the nail on the head. You know, formative is ongoing, it's daily, it's not sort of surface deep, it's about retrieval practice and building on those prior learning blocks. It's all about the metacognition of what those students know and where they need to go. And obviously doing that on an ongoing basis, whether it be exit tickets, multiple choice quizzes, really quick fire recall, it's all about cementing and solidifying that prior knowledge. So for me, formative is perhaps signalling a massive shift from, as Dave said, summative assessment, teaching to the test, but making sure it's ongoing on a day-to-day basis. It's absolutely critical in what we do as our teachers and as planners. We really have to make sure it's part of everything we do with our curriculum planning.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Steph. And I think that is really important, this ongoing day-to-day part of your everyday teaching. Damian, is there something you wanted to add to that there?
Have I muted myself?
No, you're there. We can hear you. Great.
Yeah. So you know, it was a really good video from Dave, and I think so formative assessment, you know, gives us inferences that provide useful and consequential information for teachers from their pupils, which we can then obviously feed back to the pupils. I think tonight is a really good one to start on, though, because I think whether we've got a new curriculum or the old curriculum, or whether we teach in England or USA or Australia, the sort of day-to-day practices of formative assessment should be pretty much the same. Good formative assessment is good formative assessment, no matter where you work in. I think one of the keys, though, which makes this session so important, is that the quality of ongoing formative assessment really rests on how well you've designed your curriculum, how coherent and ambitious it is, to make sure that actually the ongoing formative assessment that you can continue to get feedback from your pupils and feed forward to them so they can further improve it is actually worthwhile doing.
Absolutely. Thank you, Damian. I think it's really important for everybody to consider that there are still things that we don't know about how assessment is going to work in Wales. But one thing that everybody can do is make sure that their assessment practice in their classroom is really, really good. So that's one thing that everybody could be working on. Is there anything that anybody else wanted to add to that? Because we haven't mentioned, Ceri, we haven't mentioned summative assessment. I don't know if you're going to
I was just going to bring that in, actually. I think both of those are spot on, and it comes back to something else that Dave said about having that collective understanding of what it is that we mean by formative assessment. One thing that's become particularly apparent to us in our professional inquiry reviews and things that we do in school annually is not always is there that consistent understanding of even the most simple things that we talk about in terms of pedagogy. We've been looking at modelling, haven't we? And just even looking at teacher modelling, that everybody is talking about something slightly different. So I think it's getting to the nail on the head there, really drilling down is, well, what do we actually mean by formative assessment? We're really looking at the aim here to reveal what are our pupil weaknesses so that then the teachers can act on them. And then obviously when assessment is summative, the aim is to give a final grade. And I think, again, there's a danger here that we go into one camp or the other. And I do think that formative assessment is the focus here, and it is that ongoing, day-to-day small progression steps, where that progression model needs to be specific. It needs to break down all those complex skills into those smaller tasks, that we don't overload our students. We take into context that cognitive load theory, but also we do need an element of summative assessment that needs to be far less frequent, almost infrequent. But I think the two of them that we really need then to figure out, well, what's the balance and the relationship between the two of these? And that's another discussion we really need to drill down into on a school level, is, well, what's the purpose of our assessment? I think that's the thing, is why are we doing this?
Absolutely. And I think that is absolutely why we started these discussions, is that we need to have this open discussion. It should be something that's happening in schools all of the time. I'm going to move on to another question here, because something that you touched on, Ceri, and something that Dave mentioned in his film was this link between curriculum, assessment and pedagogy. And how do those three actually link? Is there anybody who wants to hazard a guess? Yes, Andy.
I think all three of them are directly linked within one another. I don't think you can have one without the other. I think, obviously, from a day-to-day perspective, when you're sitting and when you're walking into your classroom and you've got your planning in front of you, that's your curriculum. But by the end of the week, you should have a good idea of what it is that you're able to do the week after, based on your assessments throughout the week, and what the pupils in front of you have achieved. I'd be honest in saying that if I just did exactly what was written on my piece of paper, because it says this is what I need to do in week 1, this is what I need to do in week 2, this is what I need to do in week 3, whereas actually half of my class haven't really picked up what I meant to do in week 1, then I'm doing them a disservice. So that's a really nice straightforward way to describe it, is that you teach something and then you assess it to see what you're going to teach next, because what is curriculum is a response to learning needs. So it could be all kinds of things: the planning on your classroom desk, the plan for your whole school, and so on. Anybody else wanted to add on the links? Barry?
Yeah, I mean, just looking at those links, I mean, I'm a bit of a practical sort of thinker, engineering background, and I love all this research, but very often I get lost and don't understand what that means for me in practice in the classroom. So in thinking about those links, well, if I want to do some formative assessment, then I have to have some idea of what it is that I want them to learn. So there's my learning objective, which links clearly straight into the curriculum. My next question is, which is the most effective way of doing that? There's my pedagogy. So that's my sweet answer for you on that one.
And a nice straightforward answer. I think we want plenty of those as we're going through today. And I think it's opening up the discussion. One of the things, and I'm going to drill down a little bit here now, one of the things that was touched on in the film, but I know that it's a question that a lot of people are interested in, is originally we had achievement outcomes, and we now have, they've been renamed as descriptions of learning. And I don't think the actual content has changed a great deal, it's the name for them has changed a great deal. And Welsh Government are clear that in saying that they're not expecting schools to assess directly against the descriptions of learning. So my question to you all, and this is a bit of a challenging question now.
I think before we were going to do that, Finn, we were going to do a very short poll.
Oh, yes. Sorry. Hang on to that question.
I'm trying to interrupt you there very briefly. So we're going to do a very short poll.
Right, so here it is.
Okay, so we've got about half of you voted so far. It's one of those questions that...
Right, keep polling, keep clicking, and then we'll get back to the actual question.
I'm just waiting for the percentages just to stop a little bit, and then we're on 3/4 of you. Anticipate if you can all guess what the response is going to be. I think we've got the majority of people voting. Not everyone could get to the screen to do it. So our results are there.
Share results, yeah. Interesting. So again, we've got people in the middle. Sorry, it's just my phone. I need to turn that off. People in the middle, but more are more confident than the rest. Okay, so my question was actually what it was to the panelists is, how do you expect teachers to actually use the descriptions of learning? How do you expect teachers to use the descriptions of learning? Right, we've got Barri and we've got Steph. I'm going to go to Barri first, and then Melissa, I'm probably going to come to you for our foundation phase specialist. Okay, Barri.
Yeah, I mean, obviously those descriptions of learning are the big picture, and you know the way that they're set out, it is really, really important from my point of view. This is a curriculum from foundation phase to GCSE. We're not having this breaking it down, and that's really, really important for us to establish from the start. But you know, really, when Dave's talking about the hard thinking that needs to go on, you know, these descriptions of learning are not sufficient for day-to-day learning. They're not detailed enough. They don't drill down into the nitty-gritty of the subjects and you know, domain-specific knowledge that we want those children to have. And what's really, really going to be the biggest challenge of all is the fact that how are we going to get that cohesion from foundation phase to GCSE in terms of the trajectory those learners are taking throughout. So, you know, we have to get together to devise those steps of learning deeper than what we've got in the descriptions of learning, which are really just acting as a guide for us.
And that's really interesting, that this is the first sort of opportunity for us to say we don't have enough yet to actually design a curriculum and an assessment system based just on the descriptions of learning. That's more work for us to do. Melissa, can you tell us a little bit about descriptions of learning and anything else that you're doing in primary schools?
That's it is a big question, isn't it? And it's one of the things that we've been looking at over the last term to try and get to grips with how we're actually going to use it. It's really interesting what Barri was saying about drilling down, because that's what we've been doing. We've tried to look at it. So obviously it's meant to be a broad range of experiences for our learners. So over time, you know, there's the increasing depth of knowledge, but as Barri described, you haven't got, you know, the descriptors in the way that we had in our national curriculum levels or even in our outcomes. So you're at a point now of are we meant to be putting the meat on the bones in our own schools at a school level, at a cluster level, at a Wales level, or are we reading too much into that? Are we going back to our previous curriculum and trying to fit what was there from that into our, into the new curriculum? So I think that that's where we're sort of struggling at the moment with actually how much we progress on with this and how much detail we add to try and get it to look similar to something that we've been used to previously. It's an individual progress journey. It's all about that, isn't it? It's all about the individual. So that's going to look very different for all. So
it is. It is going to look very different. I think it's very interesting to hear that that's currently what you're working on. And of course, designing the steps in between the progression steps is about knowing what it is that you're actually assessing, because until you set that objective, you don't know what you're assessing on a day-to-day ongoing basis. Can
I just bring in it's not so much of a question, but it's a statement from Kay Smith in the question answers. And I know other people have been putting questions in that haven't quite fitted in with the discussion where we were. It's moved on slightly, so we will come back to those. So I haven't forgotten you. She said the descriptions of learning are not the same as assessment objectives with a different name. Actually, the descriptions of learning are not for the pupils or assessing them. They are for the teachers to plan the next steps for learning. You can't compare them, in my opinion.
Any thoughts on that? So the descriptions of learning are not the learning objectives, and you can't assess directly against them. And anybody agree with that? Disagree with that?
I agree with that. That's exactly the point I'm trying to make. They're not sufficient in terms of tracking or understanding what it is that the children need to learn. They're far too broad and far too generic. So they show the direction of travel, but don't break it down into steps. I think that's down to us as teachers to do.
For example, we've got in the language literacy and communication, we've got descriptions of learning that say, I can understand what I've read. Well, how can you measure what you understanding? It happens in here. So it's very difficult to measure. Damian, did I see your hand? Sorry, Ceri, I'll come back to you as well. No? No, okay. Ceri, you had something.
I just wanted to make one short observation there about those descriptors really describe what the performance looks like at the end. They don't explain how to improve it. So they don't really help us in terms of formative feedback at all.
That fits in very nicely with a question that Susie Credit Bennett has also put into print a little while ago when we were talking about formative and summative before it moved on. She said, surely the balance between formative and summative is also going to be determined by how our learners at Key Stage 4 are going to end up being assessed in 2027.
Yeah, so we've got questions about assessment coming right through from foundation phase all the way up to Key Stage 4. And obviously qualifications is still under review at the moment. I just want to move on because we've got a lot of areas to discuss today, and I want to make sure that we cover as many of them as possible. Whenever you talk to teachers about assessment, invariably you actually end up talking about accountability. And one of the questions that we actually had through on DMs was a question from someone talking about how you would show evidence of ongoing assessment. Now, I'm not asking you to actually answer that question, but maybe address why that question might have been asked in the first place. So anybody want to look at this link between assessment and accountability? Damian.
Yeah, I think this is one of the areas I think we need to have a real shift in Wales. I think, as Ceri said earlier, some of the quantity of summative assessment in any subject needs to be quite clear during the year. And I would argue that in between those points, you shouldn't be recording any data at all for two reasons. Sorry,
I have just written down, my next question was, should we be evidencing ongoing assessment? And you've just answered that, haven't you?
Yeah, and for two reasons. Firstly, like classroom practice, what you observe from the pupils is performance, not necessarily learning. But also what happens is you spend so much time writing down some of these low stakes test quizzes, or how many pupils went for A, B, C and D, than actually responding to what's happening live in front of your classroom. And I think we've Dave talked earlier about this need to be responsive teaching. Good assessment for learning is good pedagogy, is responsive teaching, where you're finding out as much as you can about your learners and where they are, what their misconceptions are, and you're responding in as close to real time as you possibly can. The more time you spend recording those marks, and they're only marks of performance anyway, the less time you've actually got to do something responsive about it.
Absolutely, and I think that if we can reduce the amount of time that teachers are spending on things that don't make a difference, then absolutely we can focus on what children need, which is identifying the next steps that are going to be useful for them in their learning.
Can I bring a question from Kevin? Kevin Stroud, it was right at the beginning when we were talking about the confidence, and I think he's linked it straight into accountability, which is where it fits now. He said, in Risca stating the obvious, I'm sure schools would feel much more confident about engaging more fully with purposeful assessment if it wasn't for the hang-ups from existing Welsh Government accountability measures.
Thank you, Kevin, for that comment. Okay, I'm going to park that one, and we're going to move on to something a little bit else that is commonly talked about, and it's something that Dave mentioned in his film earlier on as well, is this shared understanding of progression. And this is a really common refrain that Welsh Government are talking about, that it needs to be within schools, it also needs to be across schools. And I think it's one of those phrases that hides this enormous iceberg behind it of, you know, it's a huge idea. Is there anybody willing to give that one a bit of a tackle? What is a shared understanding of progression? Andy, brave man, thank you.
I mean, at the minute, a shared understanding of progression is the national curriculum levels that we've already got. And that, I think that's what's missing. I think, I believe it was William, when you were talking about when he was part of the panel that wrote, kind of created the national curriculum levels way back when they changed the systems. I think back in England, actually, the first time around. When they talked about having the progression, they actually talked about saying they would end up with like nearly 20 possible levels of progression to show accurate progression, and then they broke it down to 8. And even that, and they became very, very wordy things. But as teachers, we knew exactly what it was we were trying to aim for those children. And at the moment, we don't have that. And to aim for a shared idea of progression is very, very difficult without getting lots and lots of people together and actually saying this is what it should look like. You know, what we sit down in my primary school here and unpick and decide is progression that we want to see might be completely different from what Melissa sees in her school. And so the question then is who's right and who's not.
Let's just explore that for a second, because I obviously some people will have jump right to that concept and really understand it, but why is it that Melissa's school or Ceri's school might have a different understanding of what progression actually is? Anybody willing to address that? Right, I'm gonna have a go at this one, just because people are all standing a little bit back. I think when Andy, you said when we had the national curriculum levels and having that understanding of progression was part of that, we had a national standard because everybody had the same prescriptive elements within the curriculum, the same periods of history, the same authors. Now we don't have that. In September 2022, we don't have the same authors because it's going to be a local curriculum. We don't have the same periods of history. And I think that getting a shared understanding of what progression looks like in my curriculum, where we're doing World War I and Macbeth, and what it looks like in Barri's curriculum, where that he's doing, you know, the Tudors and a completely different author, Roald Dahl, then that is really, really difficult. How can we manage this? Yes, Steph, different shared understanding of progression.
Yeah, I mean, for me, Finn, it comes back to having that shared language, that commonality, even if it's just working within your family of schools and, you know, moderating, networking, having those ongoing conversations and making it part of your day-to-day teaching, really, but having some sort of shared common language as to what Macbeth looks to you for this assessment or what Hitler looks like to my school for this assessment. I think we just have to almost force ourselves to keep having these ongoing conversations. How we set that up is obviously another milestone to try and hit, but just having some sort of hooks or continuous things we can say, yeah, we can put our hat on that. We understand what that means collectively across all of our network of schools.
Yeah, that fits in really nice with a question from Alex Barrons. He said, is the shared understanding about collaboration between local schools and in particular clusters of schools?
And this is a question that I wanted to ask you. I actually wrote this down earlier on. We've heard a report of, and it is just an anecdotal evidence that consortia and clusters of schools are talking about non-negotiables, these things that everybody needs to teach that would provide that assessment against. And is this the way in which we might actually manage the shared understanding of progression? Because it sounds like to me that amongst the panelists here now, we don't have that shared understanding at the moment. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah.
Yes, Damian, thank you.
Yeah, you know, like the curriculum has got to be the progression model, doesn't it? So, you know, if you're talking to a subject leader about their curriculum from in my perspective in secondary, from year 7 to year 9, you know, why are they picking certain topics there? You know, if it's a hierarchical sort of difficult subject, you know, why have they chosen why have they chosen that as the narrative of the subject? Or if it's a quality, why is this taught in year 7? How would you build on that in year 8, etc., etc. So I think unless we get some non-negotiables in, the curriculums across, you know, we're going to have 1,600 completely different curriculum, and the idea of progression then is going to be completely different in each and every one. We could really have done with these non-negotiables with a bit of meat on the bones probably 4 years ago. You know, there's lots of new curriculum that I like, but, you know, I think a lot of people said for a long time it really, you know, this lack of prescription means that this idea of this shared idea of progression, I think, is impossible across Swansea schools, let alone across Welsh schools.
Yeah, so a big question there, and one we as a panel can't actually answer at the moment, Jane.
I think Simon's put a question in the question answer, and I know there are other questions in there which I'll come back to. He said, isn't these shared non-negotiables just going to take away from the independent ethos of the new curriculum? I don't know what the panel think about that one.
Are we seeing, let's have a thumbs up. Who thinks it's going to take away from the independence? Thumbs up or thumbs down on that one? Let's go full gladiator. What do you reckon? Or maybe halfway? Okay, we've got a lot of people sitting in the middle there. That's interesting.
And Angela's just dropped in as well. Surely if you have non-negotiables, that's the prescriptive curriculum by the back door.
Yeah, there is that possibility. Yeah. So can we see, are there any other polls that we want to run before we finish?
We've got one more poll, which I'm doing now.
Okay, so last poll coming out now. Okay, let's see what people think on this. Okay.
That awkward silence, isn't it?
The awkward silence. Yeah, we've got lots of people voting. How are we doing here now? So we've got well over 70% of people have voted by now. We'll be sharing it.
I think this is quite
I think it's an obvious answer.
One. Okay, there we go.
Have you shared it?
Yeah, I have shared.
All right. I can't see it.
We've got, yeah.
Oh, sorry,
a delay.
Technical. Okay. Right, so every time you assess, every time you talk to a pupil and ask a question, every time you ask them to draw their understanding, every time you do a quick quiz, you need to know why it is that you're doing that. Okay, so we're coming to the end. I'm just going to ask one final question of our panel, and it has been a really fascinating discussion. Obviously, the focus of today has very much been on formative assessment and this focus on the ongoing process. So how do we keep the focus of formative assessment on the looking forward as opposed to the looking backward? Barry.
If I can jump in on there, I'm a little bit edgy about the use of the word new curriculum, as if curriculum is something new. It's just another version of it. So I want to put that out there to start with.
Good point.
And now I've been long in the tooth and in the job for far too long now. I decided to go back to where my journey started. Anybody remember these? I'm sure Damian will remember these. And, you know, that brought about quite a revolutionary change in the way that we looked at school and how we did assessment. And you know, just because that's me, I had to go and dive into these today. And do you know what? It's just as fresh reading that today as it was back then. So, you know, questioning. How do we do questioning? Do we give the children enough wait time? Do we give them time to process the question and then gather their thoughts before we ask them to respond? You know, how good are our learning objectives? Are they on point, or are they just something to fill our time, you know? And I guess that goes back to the progression again. Looking at the self-efficacy of the children. Is this building their confidence? Is this helping them to feel good about their learning, or is this knocking them back and knocking their self-efficacy? You know, there's a talk about climate, culture and ethos within the classroom. Is this a supportive environment where you are, that you can make mistakes and that's okay, and you're not going to be ridiculed because that's actually how you go about learning? You know, the ways that we give feedback, you know, written feedback. Is it worth it? Whole class feedback, is that better? Is it more efficient? Is verbal feedback valued enough in the things that we do? All of these questions came out, you know. Doing self and peer assessment well cannot be achieved unless you include the learners in the process. They have to be a part. So I think it was Steph mentioned earlier about that metacognition, that learning to learn. You know, being self-aware as a learner, that's all part of the same journey. There's mention of learning theory. How refreshing is that? Teachers talking about how you learn. What's the best way of doing something? Is there a better way that we can do that? This worked well for me. It worked well in this context. It didn't work in another context. Now, I have to say, you know, looking at it from the lens of this side of my career, all this is doing is telling me that I need to go back to look at Teach Like a Champion. I need to look at the techniques and the principles that are put there. I mean, you know, if you look at things like, you know, Everybody Writes, for instance, what an amazing way of getting that formative feedback in. You know, there's just loads. I could go on, but you know, it's classroom craft.
Absolutely.
Every day, formative assessment is about the craft of the teacher at the end of the day, and that's what we need to focus on, is us being better teachers in class. Sorry.
And I think that's really interesting that you bring us back full circle to one of the first things that Dave mentioned, which is the link between curriculum pedagogy and assessment, that it is in a one the same thing as you're doing every day. And as we mentioned before, that the one thing that all schools can be doing right now is making sure that their teachers, their staff, their colleagues have really good assessment practice and all those lovely things that you mentioned, and reflecting on what they're doing. So professional learning is one of the things that it should be a focus for us all at the moment. Right, I'm not going to ask any more questions from the list that I've got in front of me. Is there anything else that we just want to ask?
We've got a mix of questions and comments, so I think we'll run through them all, just so
we've got a couple of minutes left, so
we'll talk about the comments as well. And there are a couple of questions. There's one question I want to come right back to the end, because I know it could take us an hour. It's got Jane Miller, and I know it's not me, so it must be somebody I've sent the link to in a hurry halfway through. So it's not me, it's from somebody else. We looked at the progression steps and looked at how we can create provision through the years leading up to this. It's obvious that the one onus on us as teachers and staff and not on the children. Okay, so there's that one there. From Kay Smith, it's personal to the school. So I think when we were talking about the assessment is the learning objectives. It's personal to the school. It's not a one size fits all. The school should decide how they will feedback and share with the learners and parents. I think that one's we've had. Apologies if I've missed anybody out. Manon has said it's a great worry that we're still having this conversation now when the curriculum is being implemented in 2022. Teachers need answers now to enable them to plan effectively.
Yeah, and well, you know, the election is happening today, so let's hope that somebody does something really sensible and either gives us more time or more support. Okay,
I've got two from Joan. She said evidence of assessment is key for learners with ALN. We haven't mentioned ALN today, have we?
No.
We need evidence in order for them to be recognised as ALN under the new ALN bill, which is
important.
And Joan has also said the non-negotiables would be skills-based, surely, not content-based.
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure we have time to look at the difference between skills and knowledge and whether there is any difference in how we learn about them.
And I've just noticed some naughty people putting questions in the chat rather than the question answer. So I will come back to, I won't be able to pick all of those up, but it might be you can all see those. There's one question from Ceri. With the new curriculum, will the Welsh Government national test go? Does anyone know this?
Right, so let's have a thumbs up or a thumbs down on that. Thumbs up if you think the national personalised assessments will go. Thumbs down if you think they will stay.
Or
so assessments are going.
Yes, who knows, isn't it? Yeah.
Right, so either we don't know or they're staying for good.
Okay. And I'm just going to pick in the 4 minutes that we've got left, and there might be a question where we are. I'm going to come back to yours, Lynn, in a minute. From Adrian, with progression, as a secondary school teacher, I would like to see a more consistent bridge built between primary and secondary schools. Too many pupils from too many primary schools enter secondary without the basic skills let's not start the primary secondary argument here.
No, because let's not forget that pupils enter primary school with no skills at all.
Too many pupils from where am I? With there are good primary secondary projects, but this is not universal or even monitored by Welsh Government.
So transition is an issue that we haven't been able to look at today, but that's obviously assessment in transition. How important is that?
Barry, Kevin has said good documents there. I think we'd all agree on that one. And from somebody who just says so I'm not sure who you are, non-negotiables would limit creativity in a sense of content. However, non-negotiables for assessment would be your bread and butter skills. We found that the revised numeracy and literacy frameworks are more prescriptive than the what matters statements, and are hoping to use these to guide our personalised assessments.
So there's some really interesting questions and comments from all of the panelists that we've had, the attendees that we had. I'm sorry that we can't look at all of them, but hopefully we will try and share some of these questions and comments on Twitter over the coming days.
I did say I was going to
come back to one last question. Sorry.
And I think this is the one where we run after this one. Should schools be invested in inexpensive tracking systems? I think that's a unanimous
Well, I think if we
answer
say expensive, then absolutely not. You know, we want really good quality, but for not much money. That would be perfect. Okay, so can I hand now over to Dave, who has been very quietly watching all and listening to everything, and obviously providing the film as well, just to round everything up before we say goodbye to everybody. Thank you, Dave.
Well, no, thank you. What a brilliant discussion. Some fantastic ideas from the panelists. I've been watching the chat and the questions come through as well. And I think it's clear that that point you made early on about the fact that actually people are really keen to start having these discussions is absolutely right. So I've scribbled just a couple of ideas down just to kind of pick out a couple of themes that I think might pose kind of further conversations beyond today. Back in the mid-1990s, I'm a history teacher by background, so this is a history thing, but Dennis Shemelt wrote a paper reviewing the use of national curriculum levels in history. And he bemoaned the fact that what should be a scaffold had become a cage. And I think we need to be really careful that we don't place too much value on these very precise things that come from somewhere else that actually probably deep down we probably don't think really represent what real learning looks like. We know learning's messy, we know it's not linear, and actually probably what we need to move to, or we need to keep building on, we've got this far through this idea of co-construction, that actually there's a huge amount of knowledge and wisdom and expertise sat in our classrooms, and that for the last 20, 30 years that has been systematically devalued. We've told teachers that their answers are somewhere else and it's up to you now to do this right. There's someone in another room that knows the answers. And I'm not sure they do. That was never my experience as a classroom teacher. And so probably what we need to think about is not necessarily the term shared understanding, although that's important. I think it's the develop a shared understanding. And the question is, how do we do that? How do we think about now looking at those learners and growing an understanding of what progression looks like from those learners in our classrooms? We've got those kind of broad mountaintop descriptions of learning. And it was very interesting watching the pioneers have those discussions about how detailed should they be, and what the problems are is trying to marry up this idea of kind of a bottom-up curriculum with kind of these ideas about what does that learning look like for that individual learner. I think it's important to remember that we're starting a process here. Barry's right, we're not starting from nothing. There's some really good practice out there in our classrooms that we can, and our schools, that we can capture and we can build on. And there was a question or a comment about the fact that actually we need to get all of this ready by 2022. And I don't see 2022 as an end date. I see it as a start date now. If you look internationally at where curricula are successful, they are curricula where governments listen to their teachers, listen to the schools, listen to the system, and the system keeps getting better over time. It isn't one where somebody says, here we go, this is it, you've just got to do it really well. And 5 years later, we realized actually that wasn't how we did it really well. And someone else comes out and has a go. So I think for me, today's been a really, really great start to some conversations that I hope we can keep having from now on. And we recognize that actually the answers aren't going to come from somewhere else. The answers are going to come from us, working with those learners in our classroom and bringing to bear that huge amount of professional wisdom that we have, but recognizing that there isn't an answer somewhere. We need to work together now to work out what the answers are for our learners.
Great, thank you very much, Dave. And I would like to say a great big thank you to all our panellists for taking a bit of a risk and having this open and honest discussion about what assessment means in curriculum for Wales. We're really looking forward now to our next session, which is in 2 weeks today. Have we got the original poll that we did right at the beginning? Can we rerun that poll just before we finish to see if there are any differences in this session? So we've got one last poll for you, and we will be able to download the results to these polls and share them with you on Twitter and on social media over the coming weeks. So one last opportunity for you to have a quick vote on how ready you feel. And already I can see the results are looking very different from where we started.
There's not as many I'm getting theirs, I can tell you that now.
Yeah, okay.
We've made the situation worse.
I don't know.
We should be doing a second one.
Okay, should we share the...
Right, okay. So I think we're roughly on about 2/3 of you have voted. So we're just going to stop at this point.
And share the results. There you go. So we've hopefully shifted some people's thinking to feeling a little bit more confident that they know where they're going and they know what they're doing, or at least where to start with this first purpose of assessment, supporting individual learners on an ongoing day-to-day basis. So thank you all to all of our panelists, and thank you all to all of our attendees for coming and for having this conversation. Please don't forget the hashtag Let's Talk Assessment. Keep this conversation going. Let's keep talking about it.
Can I just add on to that as well with Finn, that please look out for the email for the next session. Yeah. I know we've had a number of people whose emails bounce back because I think in desperation to get tickets, they put email addresses in wrong. Oh, so if you know people who had tickets that couldn't access the session today, we've tried to rectify as many as possible, but you know, they obviously haven't been able to get in there. And I know some of our emails do tend to end up in junk or spam. So you know, if you know of colleagues that couldn't get in, just ask them to look for the link for next time. But you should all get the link automatically for the DAISY session.
Yeah, and just to reassure you all that we are going to look at a way to share this session, the recording of this session for free as widely as possible. And we are going to be sharing it just online for free because it's such an important discussion. So let's make sure that this is the start of something really exciting, talking about assessment like it is really important for the children of Wales.
But if you do have any questions following today's session, just drop us an email at inquiries@impact.wales or DM us on Twitter, and we'll make sure we can build those into session 2.
Absolutely. So don't forget to vote, and we will see you in 2 weeks' time. Bye now.